Starting off the month, and because of Paul Rubens' passing, I rewatched Pee-wee's Big Adventure. This is a movie that I had watched since I was little and hadn't seen in about a couple of years. I was curious how I would view it after all this time, and it has not aged at all. In fact, I think scenes and Paul Rubens' performance are even funnier now. The two things that I really zeroed in on this viewing is how good the score is by Danny Elfman, and how he's able to weave in influences like the Wicked Witch theme from The Wizard of Oz into certain tracks. And the other thing that stood out this time was the ending, and how satisfying it is to see everyone that Pee-wee has interacted with and how he has changed some of their lives. It was a wonderful start to the month. After that, I started my first watch for the month, which was Hitchhike from 1977, which is an exploitation thriller starring Franco Nero, Corinne Clery, and David Hess. This movie was wonderful and very unpredictable. What starts out as a hostage road trip movie turns and becomes something a lot darker in the last half of it, and it even becomes Duel at one point, and it is fantastic and purposefully disorienting. Everyone is amazing in this, but the standout is Franco Nero. His character is such a scumbag, and he plays it so well. Corinne Clery also has to go through so many ranges of emotion and is equally as good as Nero. If you're in the mood for an exploitation movie from the 70s, check this movie out, especially the subtitled version. Next, I watched Roadhouse 66. I was intrigued by this movie since it stars both Judge Reinhold and a very early performance by Willem Dafoe. It's your standard underdog outsider story, and with the help of his cooler friend who has to win the big race against a gang of racers in a desert town. Overall, I was into this movie for the first 20 minutes. You have an amazing setup, especially with Dafoe's introduction, but then it slows down and honestly just gets boring and dull after a while, and it never quite recovers from this. Next, I watched Crimes of Passion, directed by Ken Russell. Russell has been a huge blind spot for me. The only one of his movies that I've seen up until this point is Lair of the White Worm, which I very much enjoyed, but it's been a while since I've seen that. With Crimes of Passion, I loved this movie. I adored the style that Russell brings to this world and how sleazy it feels. Kathleen Turner is so incredible in this movie that I feel that this and Serial Mom are her best performances, but right alongside her is Anthony Perkins, who honestly should have competed for an Oscar for his performance in this movie. This thing has some incredible scenes in it, especially one where it's just two people talking in bed. But the way the scene plays out is so raw and emotional, and I was not expecting that from this movie. This would probably pair well with Brian De Palma's Body Double, which I saw for the first time this year too, and absolutely adored. Next up, I rewatched Heathers. I hadn't seen this in probably more than 5 years, but I was able to recall the structure and tone of it. I had a good time revisiting this. I think my favorite part of this is definitely the atmosphere. Every scene has this smoky haze to it, mixed with a really good score, which I think makes some of its very dark comedy aspects pop. But for me, if I wanted to go for a slightly surreal high school coming-of-age movie, I would go for 3 O'Clock High. Next, I rewatched From Beyond from 1986. I remember watching this on TV on this channel called Monsters HD when I was probably 12 years old, and this movie blew my mind when I first saw it, and I still love this movie. I love body horror and I love goopy effects, and this is a prime example of those. Stuart Gordon is a fascinating filmmaker, and his collaboration with Brian Yuzna is wonderful. And I have become even more fascinated with Yuzna over the years. I think he is incredibly underrated in terms of his producing and directorial work. From Beyond combines the best qualities of Gordon and Yuzna and perfects them. Next, I watched The Leopard Man from 1943. This is a Jacques Tourneur directed and Val Lewton produced film. I think this movie is most famous for a scene involving a little girl going out to the store in the middle of the night and being stalked by an escaped leopard from the zoo. I think this sequence is one of the most effective horror sequences of the black and white era. There are other sequences throughout that have an incredible sense of foreboding dread, like something is watching the characters that we're following. but we don't know what it is that's watching them. Overall, I think this is a very effective horror movie with an outstanding sequence. After that, I watched The Rift from 1990. This movie is grouped into the other underwater movies that came out around the same time. The Abyss, Leviathan, and Deep Star 6 being some of them. The Rift was such a nice surprise. It's a gnarly movie with some great creature effects and all the goop you could ask for in a movie. And it makes sense coming from the director of Slugs and Pieces, Juan Piquer Simon. R. Lee Ermey is great in this, and I think has a really effective character turn, where he starts out as the drill sergeant from Full Metal Jacket, but turns into a genuinely endearing character with some fantastic moments towards the end. I then watched Whiskey Mountain from 1977. This is a Deliverance knockoff, which is a subgenre I absolutely love. My favorite being Rituals from the same year, which I think almost transcends that genre trapping. With Whiskey Mountain, I thought this movie was boring for long stretches of it. The thing that kept me going through it was the promise of an amazing last shot. And while I think the last shot is effective and pretty different for the time, I don't know if it was worth it. Next, I watched Two-Lane Blacktop from 1975, directed by Monty Hellman. I would say that this is my first proper Hellman movie. I've seen Silent Night, Deadly Night 3 and Beast from Haunted Cave, but I don't know if you would call those proper introductions to Hellman's style. With Two-Lane Blacktop, the best way I can describe it and what I thought of it is it's the perfect example of what people call a mood piece. Not much happens, and there are scenes where I don't really know what it's meant to represent, but I really enjoyed the fact that they exist in the world of this movie. Next, I watched Bloodbath from 1966, which is a Frankenstein of a movie, with different scenes directed by Jack Hill and others directed by Stephanie Rothman, stitched together to form one movie. There are parts that are very hard to follow without this knowledge, but going into it knowing that, it's a fascinating viewing in terms of editing and to see how they can essentially cut 3 different versions of the movie together into one. Next up, given the fact that William Friedkin had passed away, I rewatched Sorcerer. I don't have a number one favorite movie, but I do have essentially 10 movies that I kind of cycle through when talking about some of my favorite movies, and Sorcerer is one of those 10. This movie has everything I love all combined into one. From the set pieces that top the previous one to the tension that I've never ever experienced in any other movie. The production stories, the score which introduced me to Tangerine Dream. I think that this is one of the best American movies ever made, and it only gets better with age. Next up, I watched a Russian movie from 1989 called Stray Dogs, and I was able to watch this via the Cave of Forgotten Films website. This is a surreal psychological horror movie involving a group of men sent out to the desert area to exterminate a pack of wild dogs that had been disturbing the area. This was a unique experience, like a Men on a Mission movie, and as it goes along, it gets increasingly weirder and weirder. The last shot is great, even though that I'm not entirely sure how to decipher what it means. The major downside to this movie, though, is the footage dealing with the animals. I'm not sure if the animal deaths on screen are real or not, but my gosh, do they feel real, and unfortunately, I think they may be. It was incredibly hard to watch, especially the scenes where you can visibly see the dogs are scared by the loud gunfire happening on set. And it really did sour the movie for me as it goes along, especially since it kept happening over and over and over again. After that, I watched a Giallo movie from 1972 called Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. On top of having an awesome title, this movie was such a surprisingly wonderful viewing. There are so many twists and turns in this movie. That's what I love when it comes to Giallos. Sure, the deaths can be a highlight, but what I'm looking for are the crazy twists throughout the story. This is an extremely sleazy movie that perfectly pairs with where the third act eventually goes. It starts out relatively slow and almost feels like a soap opera, but then it gradually picks up speed and contrasts the soap opera feel with some amazing twists and an ending that is one of the all-timers for Giallo. Next, I watched Black Narcissus from 1947, directed by Powell and Pressburger. A Matter of Life and Death was one of my favorite things that I saw in 2021. With Black Narcissus, they continue that streak of amazing movies. This movie rocks, and I went into it knowing not a lot about the plot, which I think is the way to go with this. The production design, the colors, the matte paintings, cinematography, and direction are all masterful. I could not believe that this movie was all shot in a studio and not on location. There are so many shots that feel so real that you could almost feel the cold air of the mountains. I loved where this went in the third act, where you have these nuns dealing with their own repressed feelings in different ways, some in healthy manners and others not so much. Kathleen Byron, who plays Sister Ruth, has an incredible turn in the movie, and by the time the last few scenes play out, has an amazing physical character transformation that is just wonderful. After that, I rewatched The Truman Show. When I was younger, I remember watching this so much. I think this might have been my first Peter Weir movie, and it's interesting revisiting this movie now that I've seen more of his movies, and he's honestly become one of my favorite directors. I was able to pick up on some of his style way more this time around. One of the hallmarks that I've noticed all throughout his work is his fantastic incorporation of music, particularly with synth and electronic music. I love that type of music, and he uses it perfectly all throughout his movies, and he's able to subtly use it at key moments in The Truman Show. I think this movie is still fantastic and threads the perfect balance of humor, sadness, and honestly a little existential dread, which is another staple of Peter Weir. Next, I watched Bloody Muscle Bodybuilder in Hell, which is a Japanese take on The Evil Dead. At 62 minutes, once the chaos happens, the pace does not stop. Before the chaos starts, though, it does take its time when our characters are getting to the house. I was kind of surprised by that, and even more surprised that it was able to build up a convincing atmosphere. Then when all the bloody craziness happens, it's a lot of fun. And the last shot of this movie was so unexpected and weird that it legitimately made me jump. After that, I watched The Killing of a Chinese Bookie by John Cassavetes, and this was the shorter director's cut version. This is my second John Cassavetes movie. The first movie I saw of his was Gloria, which I honestly wasn't the biggest fan of. This, on the other hand, I really got into the style and mood of it. It moves along at a leisurely pace and takes its time with Ben Gazzara's character, who is also terrific in the movie. It seems to me that Cassavetes wants to present a character study in the inner working relationships of this nightclub that Gazzara runs, and uses the facade of a crime neo-noir as a through line. Some may find this difficult to hold their attention, but I loved it, especially the scenes where we get to just be with Gazzara's character running the nightclub. Next, I was in the mood for one of my favorite subgenres, the all-in-one-night movie. So I decided to go with Mystery Train by Jim Jarmusch. Going into this one, I was under the assumption that we would follow this Japanese couple throughout the entire night. Instead, that's just the first part of 3 different stories that we follow. If you like this movie, that's fantastic. I, on the other hand, really did not like this movie. I was engaged with it when we were following the Japanese couple. They have an interesting back and forth, and I was really looking forward to seeing them on their night-long journey. But right as you really start to know their characters, it jumps to a completely new set of characters, and for me, honestly just deflated my entire enjoyment of it, and it just became plain boring. Again, I completely understand why people love this movie. It is wonderfully made, but I just don't think it was for me. Next, I watched Smooth Talk from 1985 with Laura Dern and Treat Williams. After I saw this, I was surprised of how little Treat Williams was actually in this. He's essentially in about 20 minutes of it, and that's towards the third and final act. But he makes the biggest impact. Laura Dern carries the entire movie for the first 2 acts, but once Treat Williams enters the third act, the entire mood shifts to an incredibly intense and scary confrontation between the two. It's worth seeing for those last 20 minutes alone. After that, I watched Slime City from 1988. I remember watching the trailer for this all the time on YouTube when I was little, and was incredibly grossed out by it. This movie lives up to its title. There is so much slime in this movie, and some pretty effective body horror scenes in this, especially the last 10 minutes, which are just insane. It's a low-budget movie from the late 80s, so every actor has a certain quirk to their performance that keeps the whole thing entertaining. On top of that, there's a revelation of what is really going on behind the scenes as our main character is turning into a slime-covered killer. The revelation was actually pretty creative, unique, and something that I was honestly not expecting. Next, I watched a folk horror called The Blood on Satan's Claws. Overall, I thought this movie was kind of a mixed bag. There are some amazing scenes in this movie. The concept and the mythology of what is happening to these kids is completely original. Although, there are long stretches where I was unsure where it was going and just felt like the wheels were spinning. And the music did not help it. It has a very memorable theme in the beginning, but after that, the music does not fit at all. It made some of the scenes feel less intense and less scary. Like I said, this movie was a mixed bag for me. Next, I watched The Gold of Love by Eckhard Schmidt. This is the first of his movies that I've seen, and I've been wanting to see his most well-known movie, Der Fan. With this movie, there is no plot. You essentially follow this woman through increasingly surreal vignettes throughout a city at night. Basically, what she is having is a bad dream, and the viewer is watching the dream play out on screen. So basically, nothing really fits together. It's like a stream of consciousness. For me, I think it got lost in this, and I really started to lose interest in it after a while. After that, I watched The Vanishing from 1988. Leading into this, I knew what the ending was, which is mostly what this movie is known for. It did kind of take away some of that punch that the ending has. It's an amazing ending and one of the best probably, but I feel that it would have had an even bigger impact on me if I hadn't known what it was. That's not a criticism of the movie, because all that being said, this movie was fantastic and still has surprises up its sleeve. One that completely threw me off was how darkly funny some of the scenes were, and the fact that it has a fractured narrative to it. The acting across the board is wonderful, and now having seen it, I am interested to see the US remake, which I hear has a completely different ending to it, which I don't know how they can top the original's ending. After that, I saw Oppenheimer in 70mm IMAX. The experience of seeing that in IMAX was such a memorable experience. And for being 3 hours, it really does fly by. When it comes to Christopher Nolan's movies, I've never been a diehard fan of them, but this one I would definitely say is one of his best. The standout being the Los Alamos sequence and Robert Downey Jr., who probably gives his best performance. There are scenes where I wish they would have used no score or really stretched out the scenes to wring out every bit of tension, particularly when they're putting the test bomb together. Next, I watched The Outwaters, which is a found footage experimental film released wide this year. I was really looking forward to this. The last found footage movie that I saw was Horror in the High Desert earlier this year, which I absolutely loved. It may very well be one of the scariest things I have ever seen. When it comes to talking about and viewing movies, there aren't really a lot of movies that have made me outright angry. But unfortunately, this one, The Outwaters, fits right into that slot. I hated this movie so much. It is nothing but the most obnoxious characters, the shakiest found footage, and no joke, the last hour of this movie is pitch black except for the world's tiniest flashlight. I've heard a lot of people mention the amazing sound design, and if I had to give this movie a positive, it would be that. But that's it. I felt like I wasted my time with this thing. And I generally don't like being this negative with films. I always love supporting movies and recommending movies, especially if the movie has its fans. If you like this, more power to you. For me, I hated watching this movie. After The Outwaters, I wanted to go back to a comfort genre. So I went with another all-in-one-night movie, Jungle Ground, starring Roddy Piper. While not the best one-night chase film, this movie was a lot of fun and is the perfect movie to watch on a late night. You're guaranteed some funny one-liners from Roddy Piper and some fun action set pieces. Next, I watched Murder by Death. I went into this expecting a murder mystery comedy, and what this movie ended up being is basically a parody film. But unfortunately, it does not really have the fast pace needed for a parody film. Peter Falk and James Coco are the highlights of this movie, specifically Coco, who has some amazing line deliveries. And if this movie is known for anything, it's more so the aspect of Peter Sellers' character, which can be very awkward to watch nowadays. Overall, it's just an okay movie. Next, I watched The Grey Fox, starring Richard Farnsworth. It was so interesting seeing another leading performance by Farnsworth. Up until seeing this movie, the only other lead I saw him in was David Lynch's The Straight Story, where he is incredible in. And with The Grey Fox, he might even top his performance in The Straight Story. He goes through so many different levels of emotions, and I was completely enveloped in his performance. This movie was amazing on so many levels, and it's insane that this is the director's film debut. He feels so confident and sure-handed behind the camera that I initially thought that this was directed by a seasoned pro. Have you ever been so wrapped up in a movie that you sit up and lean towards the screen? That was me throughout The Grey Fox. After that, I saw Beyond the Door 3. I haven't seen Beyond the Door, and neither have I seen the unofficial sequel called Shock by Mario and Lamberto Bava. This is a crazy and wonderful horror movie. Basically take a runaway train and add Satanists and a possessed train to the mix. The gore and effects work made me wince at multiple times, especially one involving a character tearing away their face. It starts out in a typical folk horror village setting with a group of students, but before they settle in, they are already being pursued by Satanists and escaping the village via a train, which the rest of the movie takes place in. If you like runaway train movies, check this one out. Next, I watched Faster Pussycat Kill Kill by Russ Meyer. This is my very first Russ Meyer movie, who's one of the top names amongst exploitation. The 60s and 70s exploitation genre is one of my favorites, and to see one of the most famous examples of the genre was a really cool experience. I had a great time with this movie, and I feel like I can't add anything new to this movie. The dialogue is so unique, and the performance by Tura Sartana is the highlight of the movie. This movie is iconic in terms of the exploitation boom, and has so many striking images in it. After that, I watched Baxter from 1989. Or, in terms of the way that I like saying it, Baxter. This movie is such a unique experience. It's essentially a first-person viewpoint of a sociopath, but the catch is that the point of view is from a dog named Baxter. And while this movie is technically billed as a horror movie, this movie has some very darkly comic tones to it. I loved this movie so much. The structure of it is fantastic, where you see Baxter get passed between three groups of characters. Even though a certain scene towards the end is difficult to watch, the ending is so haunting. I adored this movie and would recommend this to anyone that is a lover of unusual and unique movie experiences. Next, I watched Cold Dog Soup from 1990 starring Frank Whaley and Randy Quaid. This is another One Crazy Night movie where Frank Whaley has to dispose of a dead dog, and Randy Quaid plays a supposed taxi driver attempting to help in a sense. Quaid is the best part of this movie. He comes into the movie at 11 and stays like that throughout the rest of the movie. Frank Whaley, on the other hand, I don't think was right for this part. He was just kind of a bore to watch, and when things start to get weird throughout the night, he basically reacts to everything at the same inflection. In terms of the One Crazy Night gold list, this is probably towards the bottom of my personal list. On top of that, I really don't like the title. And when they say it in the movie, you kind of think to yourself, that's why they chose that? Next, I watched Deadline. I was able to find the Vinegar Syndrome Blu-ray with the slipcover for only $16. I feel if you go into this movie wanting a horror movie, you'll be disappointed. But if you go into it with the notion that it's a drama with cutaways to hyper gory sequences, then you will have a good time. And that's how I went into this, and I came out having a great time. It definitely has some surprising moments that I was not expecting the movie to tackle. The acting across the board I thought was very good. Just the idea of someone trying to pitch this movie to someone is so fascinating to think about. Next, I watched Unfriended Dark Web. When it comes to the first Unfriended, I thought it was just fine. It wasn't bad, it wasn't good, It was right in the middle. With the sequel, I would say that it is definitely an improvement on the first one. For one, I really like that it chose to go away from the supernatural angle of the first and go for a more thriller vibe. It kept me engaged all the way through, and given that there are 5 endings, the ending that I saw was honestly kind of laughable. All I'll say is it involves a van, and it reminded me of one of the funniest endings I've ever seen from a movie, Wish Upon. After that, I wanted to go back into the 70s exploitation realm with Jackson County Jail. What piqued my interest was this is an early role for Tommy Lee Jones, who completely steals the movie. For the movie as a whole, it's a good 70s exploitation movie. There are scenes that are hard to watch, car chases, gunfights, sleaze, and a story that you never know quite where it's going. As a double feature with Jackson County Jail, I ended up watching Kenjete Forbidden Subjects with Charles Bronson. This is director J. Lee Thompson's last movie, and I could not believe that. While not his best movie, this is definitely a movie to go out with. Charles Bronson does something in this movie in the very beginning that had my jaw on the floor, and it just sets up what this movie's gonna be like. I think it's right at that level of craziness as 10 to Midnight. After that, I watched Bone Sickness from 2004. This film was directed and starring Brian Pollin, who is known for doing ultra gory horror movies. This is a shot-on-video zombie movie with tons and tons of gore. All of the effects in the movie look really, really good. The zombies in the movie kind of look like the slow zombies from Burial Grounds. As for the story of Bone Sickness, I'll be honest, there are parts of it that I didn't really know what was happening, but then it just goes full-on craziness in the last 20 minutes with gore, zombies, puking, worms, demons, and even more gore. After that experience, I wanted to go back to the 70s again, so I went with The Last Picture Show. Last year was my first exposure to Peter Bogdanovich with Target's What's Up Doc and Paper Moon, and I loved all of them. I've been savoring the thought of watching The Last Picture Show ever since. Now having seen it, it is a lot to digest. It's definitely his most mature and heavy movie. Everyone in the movie is fantastic. Although there is one that kind of stands out. I don't know what it is, but I wasn't the biggest fan of Timothy Bottoms in this movie. I feel that every supporting character in the movie completely overshadows him and his character. But who knows, maybe that was the point. I could completely change this opinion in the future. All I can say about the last movie for August was I went out with a bang because I saw for the first time Lone Wolf and Cub, Sword of Vengeance. This movie was so incredible to experience. It's a lean movie at only 83 minutes. The character of Ogama Itsu was so compelling that I could not believe I hadn't watched this before. The sword fights are quick and brutal with tons of gore and hacked off limbs, and it makes me so excited to check out the other movies in the series. And that's it for the month of August 2023. Thanks for watching.